Okay, we are actually live. I don't know, the YouTube just really, it really just does not like me sometimes. Hey, YouTube, hey, channel, we are here. 1 second. All righty. Okay, we are good. So, welcome to BIMS TV. I'm Dr. Tiara Moore, founder and CEO of Black and Marine Science. And today I'm so excited to be having a conversation about fresh banana leaves, written by Dr. Jessica Hernandez, and lessons from plants, written by Dr. Baranda Montgomery. But first, let me start with our land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements have gained popularity, and we want to be clear that land acknowledgements are not meant to be a performance of wokeness. It is the opinion of myself and my co presenters that the intent behind a land acknowledgement must extend far beyond the words you speak. Land acknowledgement should be a part of a consistent and dedicated self practice of learning histories that were excluded in school and accepting responsibility in reconciling injustices too long ignored. The surrounding area of Alpharetta, Georgia, where I live, was the traditional territory and ancestral homelands of the Yuchi and Cherokee East peoples. These groups were displaced through governmental policies of settler colonialism. To date, there has been no meaningful efforts of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in this country. As part of this acknowledgement, myself and the speakers accept a responsibility to continually support and advocate for the sovereignty of the Native nations in both our formal responsibilities as conservation practitioners and as individuals living in a settler state. And honestly, we're going to be talking about this a lot today. How can we acknowledge and honor Indigenous knowledge in our conservation efforts and daily practices? But first, let me introduce these two powerhouse speakers. So, up first, we have Dr. Jessica Hernandez, Maya Chorty in Zapotec, is a transnational Indigenous scholar, scientist, and community advocate based in the Pacific Northwest. She has an interdisciplinary academic background ranging from marine sciences to forestry. Her work is grounded in Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing. She advocates for climate, energy, and environmental justice through her scientific and community work, and strongly believes that Indigenous sciences can heal our Indigenous lands. Up next, we have Dr. Baranda Montgomery, who is the MSU Foundation Professor of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology and Microbiology and Molecular Genetics at Michigan State University, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Academy of Microbiology, and the American Society of Plant Biologists. She was named one of SAIL's 100 Inspiring Black Scientists in America and was the winner of the 2021 Cynthia Westcott Scientific Writing Award. So, like I said, we have some awesome speakers, and we're going to have a dynamic conversation. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the YouTube chat, and we'll try to get to them throughout our conversation. Also, make sure you stay tuned all the way up until the end because we're going to be doing some free book giveaways. All right. I've been talking a lot. Did I miss anything? Do y'all want to add anything? Want to say something real quick, or we can just get started because we have a conversation to have. All right, let's get it started then. This question is definitely for both of you. We're talking about fresh banana leaves and lessons from plants. What inspired you to write these books? Why were they missing? Why is the time right for them now. So just tell me, just what got your pen to moving?
Papadichi, thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be sharing this space, especially during Black History Month. I think that one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is that, oftentimes as Black and Indigenous scientists and community members, our stories are told for us, they're written for us, and we rarely get the opportunity to tell our own stories, to write our own stories. Even when we do, there's a lot of harsh criticism, right, that comes from us telling our stories because we're questioned on the validity of whether it is truly science or whether we truly know what we're talking about. So one of the reasons why I wanted to write Fresh Banana Leaves was to kind of incorporate my experiences as an Indigenous woman in the environmental sciences, as an Indigenous woman who has been displaced from her lands because of climate change impacts and a genocide that my father survived. And I think that, having that privilege that also comes with our responsibility, I wanted to, in a way, use that to support my communities and elevate their voices. Thank you for the question.
I love that. Dr. Montgomery?
Well, first, I just wanted to start by saying congratulations to Jessica on the launch of her book. Very important work, and for the generosity of her really sharing her family's the stories of her father. And I love the story of the origin of the book's title. So I just wanted to congratulate her and also to say thank you for the invitation to be in community and conversation. So I'm going to be, if you know me, you know I'm a truth teller. I wrote this book because I love to write, but Lessons from Plants really came from me trying to have a way to talk about difficult conversations, to talk about racism in science, to talk about the ways in which Black and Indigenous and other people of color are mistreated in science. And often when you start to have those conversations talking about humans, people's defenses go up. They're afraid they're about to be called a racist. They're afraid they're about to be called a sexist. And so talking about plants gets us deep into a conversation. And when you're asking the question about plant caretaking, it's a while before people realize that you're saying, oh, I'm the one who's killing the plants. Yes, it's you. And now we need to have the conversation about what that means. So it really was a way to get around the frustration of meeting the defensiveness that comes when we have to have conversations about these very difficult topics.
Yes. And so I think because these books, come out, well, of course, Jessica, yours just came out, and then Dr. Montgomery last year, sorry, Dr. Hernandez, yours just came out, and Dr. Montgomery, yours came out last year. Why do you feel the time was right? Because both of you mentioned that talking about this in space is usually there's defenses put up. You're immediately like, oh no, I'm not reading this, I'm not going to listen. So how did you say this is the moment for this? I don't really care if they're going to listen. You have to hear me.
Yeah, I think that one of the driving forces that kind of was like, I shouldn't care. I should write this book. People are going to complain in regardless because they're going to be uncomfortable. Was just, having to tap into our resilience and to our resistance, especially during the pandemic. We saw how the pandemic and it's still impacting Black and Indigenous communities the most throughout, the global South, across the Americas. And I think that I wanted to write this book because, I completed my doctoral degree in 2020. And I wanted to kind of elevate the voices so that students coming after me, especially Indigenous students that didn't see themselves reflected in the curriculum, didn't see themselves reflected in the professors that get to teach us, that get to call themselves an expert, will kind of find a voice within that discourse. Obviously, one book cannot dismantle all those layers of oppression that we still continue to face in the academics settings. But I think that, oftentimes as an Indigenous scientist, I was always asked to cite my knowledge as though, we can find our ancestral knowledge in peer review articles, like, our elders were thinking of publishing. When in reality, even the publishing industry, it's very white, right? There's rarely any Black or Indigenous voices elevated or centered in that industry. So I think, those were the reasons. I guess I was just tired and kind of angry. I was feeling all the emotions and I wanted to center those in the book and also center my own healing, right? Because oftentimes when we experience a microaggression, when we experience any type of racism, we are told to brush it off so we can continue moving forward. But while writing this book, some of those cases or incidents came back to the surface. So in a way, I was like, oh, maybe I am actually traumatized from those experiences that I thought I had let go. And I think, it's just a way to heal and also kind of heal my entire perspective as an Indigenous woman, right? Thank you for the question.
I think a lot about things like serendipity, but also the cosmic order of the universe, and when all of those things come together. And on some level, I've been talking about these topics for a long time. The book happened to come out in the wake of America's racial reawareness, not reckoning, because the reckoning hasn't come. So I refuse to call it a racial reckoning. But also, the tragedy of the pandemic had us all in our homes. And by some serendipity, people fell in love with plants during the pandemic. They were growing house plants. Some people were afraid they were going to have to grow all their own food. So all of these things came together in time where there was this increased interest in plants, but also a need to have conversations about difficult issues about racism and oppression. And so I think that at that moment, the book came out. And when I wrote the book, I thought plant scientists would read it. But because of this moment and an increased awareness, it gave another platform. And I think our responsibility is, when the platform is there, we got to step on it and go with the conversation. So I'm grateful to have taken those opportunities and all of the conversations. It's also been really interesting. It's been a fun time to watch additional books come out, right? The book by Jessica. I think about my friend Chanda, her book coming out on the disordered cosmos. And so it's been a really interesting time for women of color to have books out about science, but that are also asking very deep questions about our place on the planet and the responsibilities we have with our scientific knowledge, our ancestors, all of that, to step on the platform and have some difficult conversations.
Yes, I agree. I think definitely the racial awakening, or like you're talking about, definitely caused a lot more awareness and a lot more conversations, but definitely not a lot of action in some spaces. We'll say that in some spaces. But here we have you two. Y'all wrote a whole book. You're getting awareness out, and there's things that people can tangibly see. But I think when I notice, when you have these spaces, you start creating this content, and I've seen this definitely with Black and marine science. There's the question, well, why? Why do you need to center, Indigenous knowledge in these spaces? Why do you need more Black and brown people in these spaces? So I would like to hear directly from you all why you think it's important, as we know, but why? Because I think that question is always asked when I'm talking to a white colleague or an ally. Like, well, why do we need to be talking about this? So why should we be talking about this? Why is this important? I'll pick. Okay, Dr. Montgomery, you start this one.
Well, I mean, the simple answer I go to is because we exist and we have a right to do science like anybody else. And because we exist and our rights to have access to these spaces has not been there, we have to talk about it. And we have to talk about it not from the perspective of the people who've owned the spaces for a long time, making space for us. Because when you talk about, one of my issues with the inclusion conversation and making space is that often happens from people thinking they still own the space and they can open up access to the space for you. And so I think it's important that we tell our own stories in our own voices, because we have the right to talk about our science, to talk about science from our wholeness, and to claim space, to reclaim space that our ancestors owned first, right? And so I think we have to have these conversations led from our perspectives, as opposed to our being included in the dominant narratives.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Montgomery. And I think that one of the reasons why we need to center Black and Indigenous voices, especially in the sciences, is that a lot of the knowledge that has been formulated by white European men, who are considered the founders of, certain scientific disciplines, are stolen knowledges from our people, from our ancestral practices. And because there's the lack of acknowledgement, right? We know that Indigenous peoples globally knew how to caretake and steward their environments before conservation actually became a thing, before conservation became a movement that was obviously led by white cisgender men. And I think that it's important because we're not the dominant voice, and we're also not the norm. And I think that especially as you both mentioned, right, this racial awakening or reckoning, whatever it is, people started receiving money to, to create more diversity and equity and inclusion projects, initiatives. There's a diversity section for every grant. So people are getting millions of dollars to lead research, not for our communities, but about our communities. And when we're invited to the table, we're rarely listened to. We're, just taking that token seat at the table. And I think that it's time for us to reclaim those narratives and also to lead the tables that we have built over the years, right? Because this is work that, the previous generation of scholars have been doing, that our communities have been doing on the ground. So I think that in a way, it's important to center our voices because we are tired, right, of doing all this free labor that ends up kind of supporting someone's career and not necessarily supporting our own communities.
Honey, yes, okay. You hit exactly where I really wanted to go to, is these obstacles that here we are, Black, Indigenous people who want to tell our own stories, but here's money being funneled to folks who don't look like us, folks who don't tell our stories well, don't even, like you said, won't invite us to the table until they've already written it. Like, hey, will you look this over for me? So what types of obstacles, if you won't mind sharing, just in transparency, have you seen as you've been going through the book process, but then now that it's out, like how has that been? Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the things that I see very similar to both of our books is that people who pick it up think that it's a solutions menu, right? Like, how do we include more Black voices? How do we use Indigenous science to heal our planets? And I think that kind of defeats the purposes of our books or the messages that we try to, in a way portray. Because, like Dr. Montgomery mentioned, is that people have to also self-reflect. They have to have these conversations. And clearly, if they're just looking for solutions, they're not ready to do that work, right? That work that will lead to their action. And I think that, that's something that I find a little bit ironic, right? Because, they often still, they're trying to be woke or they're trying to be more diverse and inclusive, but they're still wishing for us to do the work so that they can actually solve the problems that are large, right? It's like you asking people who are oppressed how to undo their own oppression. And I think that kind of contradicts, a lot of the conversations that are taking place.
I think one of the biggest obstacles is that we won't tell the truth. And you made a point that there's lots of funding now going into diversifying universities, diversifying disciplinary societies, but diversifying spaces. And when you look at where the money is going, it's going into the hands of people who haven't made these spaces diverse. But yet now they have the money and they're going to do the work. And I think part of we won't tell the truth. We won't tell the truth that we probably shouldn't be giving money to people who haven't managed to diversify their societies if they're not going to put in place leadership of these people who have that expertise. And I understand that, people are committed, they want to do the right thing, but it's also okay to say, I shouldn't be the one leading this. I'll put all my resources behind it. I'll put all of the structures and administrative support I have to help get it. But when it comes in, if we're really going to do the work, we have to get people who know how to do the work. And I think too frequently, when you look at a lot of these spaces, there are Black, Indigenous, other people of color in the organizations, but are they the ones who are helping to lead these discussions about where things are going to go? Are you even getting to tell your real story of what your experience has been? And so I think the truth is that we're so afraid that if we speak up about this, the work will go away, that we don't tell the truth, that if we aren't clear about this, this is performative. And if we're not clear about this, my greatest fear, I've shared this in several spaces, my greatest fear is that we're going to come out of this moment with a better inequality, not great steps towards equity. And those are two different things. So I grew up in the South. My parents grew up in the segregated South, and I have a better inequality than the inequality my parents had in the segregated South, but I still don't have equity. And I think at this moment, we don't tell the truth that a lot of our efforts are really about making a better inequality so that we feel better about ourselves, but not truly about tearing down and rebuilding equitable systems. And if we can't tell the truth, we can't walk to the truth. We can't build the truth. We can't live in the truth. So I'm going to die a truth teller because we have to be willing to tell the truth to get to where we really need to be.
Oh, I'm just over here like, yes, yes. Because I think you're right. I think that is a fear of when you are the only person that looks like you in a space, you tell the truth, and now you're no longer the only person that looks like you in the space because you're no longer in the space. And so I think because we aren't saying that loud and proud that this is happening, then these things are perpetuating. And so we know that now, since again, we're talking about the racial awakening, we do have truth tellers like yourselves who are talking. And so we see this this, I don't want to say overused term, but this decolonization of conservation, decolonization of conservation, decolonization of conservation. And I don't think there is a true understanding of what that actually is and what that looks like. So I would love to hear from you all. What would it actually look like to decolonize conservation, to speak the truths and amplify the leaders that should be amplified? Let's go with Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you. I think that, you hit the nail in the head, right? Where, our languages have been co-opted, our languages that, those terms that we created based on our community leadership and our community movements. And I think that with decolonization, many people are using that word, especially, um, white settlers in academia. And I think that with decolonization, they first have to self-reflect on the histories that are hidden behind conservation. We know that conservation supports a lot of leaders in that field who were anti-Black, who led violent, like kind of movements against Indigenous peoples to displace them, to steal their lands. And I think that with decolonizing conservation, we need to uplift Black and Indigenous voices. When I usually talk about Indigenous communities, I also include our Black relatives because, Blackness is rooted in indigeneity because, it was indigenous ancestral knowledge that was stolen so that they can work on stolen land, right, forcefully. And I think that with that indigeneity, conservationists kind of stole it so that they can preserve their landscapes, right, to lead that American value system that obviously is inherently racist. And I think with decolonizing conservation, there has to be a movement with land back, right, where Black and Indigenous peoples can steward the lands, they can manage the lands without having to uphold these systems that continue to favor whiteness, white supremacy, that continue to impact our communities negatively. And we're seeing that even today, right? Because the pandemic kind of amplified those disparities our communities are facing. And I think that with conservation, it's a Western construct. So even deconstructing what conservation means, because, it continues to separate humans from nature. It continues to focus on one species instead of looking at the entire landscape. And I think, even deconstructing what conservation is and its history will allow people to truly decolonize conservation. And obviously that work should not be led by white settlers in academia.
I think Jessica pretty much summed it up, but I think that, the one thing that I always think about is that we want to, I think we think about decolonization, the ways in which people think about layering change onto a system. And so we want to decolonize the system, but keep certain colonial practices. And that's just not going to work. And so I think that, as Jessica's saying, we have to be honest about the very language, the very, I gave a science talk a couple of weeks ago, and at the end, we were at the patriarchy and white supremacy. And I think I shocked the whole room because we won't even have these conversations. So I think I just would amplify the things that Jessica shared in that regard.
So, and I think that those are good. And I think we keep going back to the truth telling, and we've had a lot of conversation, but we're here to talk about your book. So do you all have a passage or an excerpt from your book that you would like to highlight, share with our YouTube community, our BIMS community, of your words that you felt were like, I'm so glad I wrote this. I was feeling myself when I wrote this sentence. Who wants to start? Go ahead, Dr. Hernandez.
Yes. Let me pick it up. And I think it's gonna be a short passage so that we don't give like a whole reading of the book. Um, I think I will start. There is little acknowledgement of what happens to our indigenous leaders who advocate for land and indigenous rights in Latin America. This is why it's hard for me to grapple with the reality that indigenous cultures and peoples are deemed as areas of expertise within the environmental sciences, where indigenous leaders and advocates continue to face alarming rates of violence for their lived and embodied experiences. What kept me motivated to start and complete this book was knowing that too often our stories as Indigenous peoples are told for us and not by us. I think it's crucial that within the environmental sciences, we call out this settler way of thinking that continues to make Indigenous cultures and communities areas of expertise while invalidating and dismissing the lived experiences of Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Yes, that was beautiful. I think it really gave like what the whole why you wrote this book, why this was important, because the stories aren't told from you. So thank you so much for sharing. Dr. Montgomery.
I'm going to read a very short piece, and people who know me know I love my son more than anything on the whole entire planet. So I'm going to read the little section from Groundskeeping. When my son was an infant, we planted his tree so that we could watch it grow and mark its seasonal and annual milestones in parallel with his own. The white spruce that we chose is evergreen. While there's no dropping of colorful leaves in the fall, the tree is constantly changing in ways that we reflected on as a family. The first year it was growing a bit off center toward the east, so we carefully tied a string around it, attached the string to a stick on the west, and gently pulled to encourage it to grow more upright. Though as a toddler, my son didn't fully understand it. We told him that this kind of gentle guidance is often needed in one's youth. And for trees, this action is most effective during the sapling stage when their trunks are still flexible. Over the years, as we checked on it and attended to his tree, I explained that his exhaled breath, carbon dioxide, would be received as a gift. The tree would take up this essence and convert it to sugars that could help build leaves or even wood, so that when he would forever be an integral part of his tree. As the spruce became an adolescent, we continued to lovingly nurture it and provide any supplemental resources and care it needed. It began to increase its annual growth at the same time as my son, whose ankle suddenly appeared below the hem of pants that had fit perfectly the week before. His tree is still maturing toward adult stage, even as he has made the transition into being a legal adult. He has been its caretaker, and it has been his teacher for nearly 2 decades. Yet we know that there are many more things the tree has to teach him and us.
So beautiful. Thank you so much for that. I think the relationship you make between caring for plants and how humans are treated is really interesting. And so I actually have a specific question for you, is that how can scientists, we're talking about folks with PhDs, some of them got maybe couple masters, how can they understand that toxic environments kill plants, that they need to take care of plants, but they can't understand that toxic environments in the workplace can kill people, can cause them to not to be able to thrive and succeed? How is that disconnect being missed by such smart folks?
I think the disconnect is missed because we compartmentalize our science as the thing that we do and produce. And we don't think about our science as the things that we should be reflecting on in terms of our life on the planet. And so we are very easy to think about all the things that we have done, all the knowledge, quote, knowledge we've produced. And then we close our lab and office doors and go home and interact with other human beings as if the principles of the universe that drive plants and environment don't somehow apply to us. And also, it's a conscious decision. Because if we choose to believe everything we know about the natural world and plants, or the natural world and whatever organism you study, and that those rules apply to us, we have to step away from colonialism. We have to step away from oppression. We have to step away from believing that people have deficits as opposed to environments not providing. And so we put up these walls so that we can operate the way we want to in human relationships, even as we, position ourselves to be the great producers of knowledge about biological organisms. And so we allow ourselves to separate, and we believe that we are not our science, that we're separate from our science and our knowledge. And that's one of the biggest barriers we have to break down if we're truly going to improve our communities, I believe.
Yeah. And I think that is the correct. That compartmentalization is what I feel like we hear the most about, or what is it? Science is objective. Is that the favorite phrase? Like, please miss me with that. So, Jessica, something that you mentioned with your book is that maybe the feedback of, you didn't provide this 1, 2, 3, 4 steps of how do we incorporate Indigenous knowledge into our conservation. And I think that's a question that I actually have, if these practices are sacred and, cannot be shared and sometimes cannot be written, how do we incorporate them in our science? Or is what you're saying we shouldn't? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that oftentimes people um confuse like what being sacred means versus what's a secret. And I was like seeing that a lot, especially the pushback I was receiving when I mentioned that. And I think that it's important for us to understand, especially, white sellers, that indigenous knowledges, especially sacred knowledge, has been stolen and it has been published by non-indigenous scholars. A prime example of that is the field of permaculture, right? Where it was this white man who went to work with Aborigine community in Australia and kind of stole their knowledges of how landscapes should be maintaining themselves, where, we kind of, they move away from the Western construct of agriculture, right? Where it demands a lot of human labor. And, he decided to package their knowledge and call it permaculture, which is like an expensive field. If you want to get certified, you have to pay hundreds of dollars. Is it benefiting the community that that knowledge was stolen from? Obviously, no, right? Because it's kind of favoring, whoever established that, whoever can get that Western accreditations to, provide that in a Western education context. And I think that with Indigenous sciences, it's important to make room for Indigenous peoples that, and that includes our Black relatives that do not necessarily have those Western credentials, but have the knowledges of our plants, that have the knowledges of our animals. My parents now live in the South, right? And there is like a lot of our Black relatives who know more about the environments than any scientist who has like quote unquote researched those environments, because, they're living in harmony with those environments, with those landscapes. There's a lot of Indigenous communities also doing the same. And I think it's kind of like using Indigenous science by Indigenous peoples and not, for us, right? And I think that that's a call for people to make room, for people to be willing to give up their power and privilege, to let these voices lead their own research so that we are stopped being, seen as areas of expertise. If you look at any college of the environment, Indigenous communities is always an area of expertise many white seller academics put on their bio, which is very problematic in that sense. And I think, giving us those spaces to lead our own research, to lead our own community-based projects that, don't benefit us for so long, right? That they haven't benefited us for so long. So I think it's a call for people to give up some of their power in that sense, especially in those academic spaces.
Wait, people have they have what in their bios? Because no, we need to, what do we need to do to get that just dispelled? Because that's completely ridiculous. But I think as I'm hearing this conversation, it's hard. I don't want to say it's hard. Well, I guess it's easy to go to the hopeless. Like, oh, there's so many white people. they're always doing something. I mean, if you want to be honest, it's like every day something else goes on. But we in our, respective areas have taken the stand to say we are going to be truth tellers. We're going to call out these practices. How do you continue to remain hopeful, to fill yourself up, and then also to be able to create the space for folks who look like us who maybe aren't there yet with their truth telling? They're still a little fearful, still a little concerned. How do we do both things, fill yourself up, but also inspire more truth tellers. Dr. Montgomery, you go ahead and start since you the key truth teller.
Yeah, I think part of, as you were talking about it, I was thinking about a conversation I had a privilege to be a part of last year. I think it was, I was on a panel with a former colleague of mine, Kyle Powles-White, who's now at the University of Michigan. And we were talking at that time about transforming the academy, and the panel, they asked if we had hope. And I always say that I aspire to hope. That's what I commit to, is aspiring to hope. I don't live in hope. But the thing that Kyle challenged us to was to redefine what hope meant. And, I think often we think of hope as a state of believing all things are possible, when sometimes hope is the commitment not to give up. Sometimes hope is the commitment not to leave the table. Because if I leave the table, I know what's going to happen. Having been a Black woman administrator, where often I'm the only person of color at the table, I have seen conversations shift when the people look across the table and see me there. I don't even say anything, but they're like, I can't even say that because she's at the table. So hope sometimes is just to remain in the space so that the presence is known. And I think hope is not a state of joy. Hope is not, I believe that we're going to all get to the promised land together tomorrow. But sometimes hope is simply staying committed to the process and staying committed to the ancestral lineage of the process. So the thing that keeps me aspiring to hope is that my enslaved ancestors persisted so that I could be assistant vice president. So I am in a lineage of hope, and I won't be the one to drop it. And so I think there are all of those things that keep me in a space of hope, but also that when Kyle challenged us to redefine what hope means for us, then you can stay hopeful. Hopeful is not often this kind of pie in the sky, puppies and rainbows that we think about. It's a commitment, it's a process, and you're in an ancestral lineage of hope. And don't be the one to break the ancestral lineage of hope.
Wow. Like, I'm over here with chills. Thank you so much. I'm just going to repeat. I wrote it down. Hope is a commitment to not give up. Like, put it on a shirt. Just put it on a shirt. I think you're right, because it is, hope is so, pie in the sky, everything's going to be great. The white people are going to stop talking about my hair tomorrow. They're going to pronounce my name right, But what if eventually, or we have something to dream for? I think that's awesome. Dr. Hernandez, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think what where I draw hope from is just seeing like people like you, Dr. Moore and Dr. Montgomery, who, even being able to have this space and have this conversation, especially when Black and Indigenous solidarity is something that, has been fractured because, settlers are scared of what we can do collectively, right? When we can address those powers that, systems of power that continue to oppress our communities. And I think that, I draw hope from just knowing that colonization kind of added so many layers. And I always see colonization as being this onion, right? Where every generation peels a layer. And obviously when you're peeling a layer of, or you cutting onions, you cry, right? And that's like the healing component of, decolonizing, where every generation is peeling a layer and we have to do that healing. And I think that, just seeing the younger generation, how much power and drive, and I say younger, like, we're getting to, to elder sometimes, when, they have so much power and they have so much energy to continue these conversations, like, seeing how they're hopeful because, they're looking up to what we're doing and what we have been able to accomplish. And I think that, is kind of manifesting all these energies that I can draw from that will allow me to continue persevering, right? Especially in academia where, we are too often the only person that looks like us in those spaces. And I think, just looking at your story, Dr. Moore and Dr. Montgomery, is like, oh yeah, that gives me hope also, right? Because we can collectively continue to push against these systems so that, the younger scholars who come after us can see themselves somehow, whether it might not be at the institution, but they can look at Dr. Montgomery's website and be like, oh, she made it, maybe I do have some hope for me to persevere in these toxic spaces that I'm currently at.
Thank you so much. I think the resilience that I see and just the passion you long for just a safe space. I think at the beginning of our careers, we all just wanted to be scientists. We just, oh no, I'm not going to get emotional. We just wanted to go in the lab and just do a little research. We just wanted to put on that white coat and understand how to pipette. And then we walk in these spaces and we're consistently and continuously treated like we don't belong there, even though they asked for diverse candidates, even though they claimed that they wanted us to be there. And then we get there and it's like, oh, whoa. And so I think for me, I've had to take a step back. What you've been talking about is like, what is actual hope and what does it look like? And how do I make a commitment to not give up? How do I get up every day knowing that some foolishness is probably going to occur, but I keep going? And I think what y'all are talking about is exactly what we need. But I think I'm tired of that weight. I think I'm tired of having to continuously do that. So what is the message that needs to be said for these environments to just stop making us have to do this? Like, is it another book? Is it a forum? I don't think there's, these diversity trainings are going as they claim. So like, what is the need as far as our community, as women and people of color, Indigenous and Black people? What can we do to truly say, hey, we're here, we're not taking this anymore? Because it's getting very disappointing. I think the tap on the shoulder that these folks are getting. That's what I'll say. And I feel like here we are doing all this work and it's still kind of messed up. So yeah, I said a lot, but whoever wants to respond, please.
And I just wanted to respond because as you were talking, the message that I always like to give is just we've had to be resilient. And what I'm about to say is not about patting myself on the back. It's an indictment of the system, right? So I've been elected to academies in 3 or 4 different disciplines because I've had to conquer that many disciplines and do mentoring and leadership work to be seen as halfway legitimate. And the thing that you said, Dr. Moore, about wanting to just show up and do science, I've done a career where I do the science, I do the mentoring, I do the leadership, I do all of this. I do that so that when a Black woman shows up to want to do science, the space is going to let her just do science, right? But we have to do all of this work preparing the environment so that can happen. And one of the things you asked, what do we have to do? I think about this quote actually from your book, Jessica, that has really just set with me. I think it was from the interview with your dad. And thank you for the generosity of sharing that conversation between you and your dad. But I think he said, I will say that I survived because nature served as a protective shield for me. It took care of me when no one would. And I think that is true of all of us. But I think in these spaces, we have to figure out also what's the thing that took care of us when no one else would, and ask, how do we have reciprocity with that thing? And so the thing that's been most important for me is a collective of women of color. The women of color who I always say, grown people use their DMs to talk about the system and what we're going to do with it. I'll find a date somewhere else, right? But the DMs are, how do you have a group chat? How do you have the DMs? And what is the collective space that takes care of you when no one else will? And whatever that space is, you better guard it with your life and take care of it equally well. And, I think as I'm watching you, Dr. Moore, yeah, we all get tired because what we're asked to do is to have more resilience than anyone else. And I want a system that does not require some of us to have more resilience than others. And so whatever that collective space is, so that when it's the day you're tired and can't do it anymore, then I'm going to step up, guard that space with your life. Build those spaces as if they mean the very breath that you need to survive. And so that's what I always encourage, is whatever those things are, that relationship that Jessica describes her father has with nature. He protects it because it protected him. You better figure out what's protecting you and protect it with your life.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for saying that. And I think we need more of those spaces, and we're also creating those spaces. So I'm grateful to be able to have that. Dr. Hernandez, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, just thank you for sharing all of that because, I'm just taking it in and I'm also getting emotional. But I think, one of the things that I always tell my dad was like, I just want to do science. And I kind of, share something similar to you, Dr. Moore. And what he told me was that we were redefining what science is, because oftentimes we are told that science is just something that you do in the lab. But as Black and Indigenous women, especially, or, non-binary folks, we are redefining what that science looks like, right? And it goes back to that conversation that we were having where science tries to be objective. But in reality, as Black and Indigenous scientists, we do not remove our whole selves from the science that we practice. And, I think that it's also acknowledging the emotions. I know that, crying or being angry is something that we try to suppress a lot. But my relatives have always told me that when you cry is actually your ancestors crying because, they're healing. We're healing those layers. They're crying through us. And I think that has allowed me to embrace crying because oftentimes, we're told, oh, in order for us to be resistant, we have to be strong. Like, when I have had bad, conversations with professors or bad experiences, I have allowed myself to cry because I know that my ancestors are crying through me because, they're, and it goes back to what Dr. Montgomery was mentioning, how, it was like that equity, right? That it, more dumb, I forget the words that you use, but, it's kind of driving through those generations. And I think that, to give you credit, Dr. Moore, the science that you're doing, like even Black and marine science, it's a science, right? Because it's elevating the Black ancestral knowledges that, are surrounded in the marine sciences. And I think that, is understanding that we're redefining science. And I think that that's why, going back to our conversations, many people do not want to tell the truth, right? Because people who are not doing what we have to do are going to end up not being scientists, right? Because we are going to redefine science. And I think that, also that's where I draw hope, right? Because, hopefully, our descendants, maybe 7 generations from now are going to be there where science is redefined, where science is something that, our communities inherit, it's validated, right? So hopefully that, that added to the conversation.
Yeah, no, I think this is great. This is the healing I needed. So this is just selfish at this point. I just needed to come in this community with you all because I think it can be, so difficult when you're trying to make these changes, try to be the voice, and sometimes you're just talking to walls, it seems. And so I'm just so grateful to have other truth tellers. But I think thinking about going back to my other question is more of inspiring that next generation, because I think what saddens me the most, and when I'm asked to make like recommendations for students to go into this person's lab or to go to this place, I don't want to. So like, how do we, still have a pipeline of scientists and actually people who are going to get educated, but I don't feel comfortable recommending folks to go into these spaces that I know aren't right. So what is the needed pathway right now when we know that there's some foolishness going on, but we also want to see more Black and Indigenous scientists? Dr. Montgomery, want to start?
Yeah, you see me over here thinking that's a tough one, right? Because it's actually part of the reason why I got into doing work around leadership, because I think we focus so long on mentoring, and I still believe in the power of mentoring, but we can't mentor our way out of racism, and we can't mentor our way out of sexism, and we can't mentor our way out of colonialist, thinking around science and other things. And so really we have to have a leadership revolution. And so that's why I've started talking about leadership, because leadership is about getting the environment right so that everything people need to thrive is available to them equitably to people. But in the meantime, the challenge is that we have to exist in these imperfect spaces while we build the spaces that we deserve. And so that's why I stay committed to the mentoring work. I stay committed to supporting every Black in STEM community, every Indigenous community, communities that are committed to helping people with disabilities and who have different gender expressions, because we have to have those collective communities around us that serve as the protective barrier for us as we navigate these imperfect spaces. And I think sometimes I am never one to say, go and work with somebody who I know is toxic because you're going to get high impact papers and just stick it out for 5 years and that'll get you the job you want. That's never going to be me. And so my question is, how do you find spaces that the people are trying to work on change so that you can have at least some chance of getting through this hole? And so we talked about bringing our whole spaces to the work, but I also want us to leave whole. And the number of students, Black students, Indigenous students, women, non-binary students who have tragic, toxic stories to tell about getting their degree can't be okay with us anymore. And so I agree with you. It's a real tough challenge trying to figure out how do you help people get the experiences that they want in imperfect systems. And I think we just have to continue to build collective communities of support, of advocacy, of truth telling, so that we have some visible means to get support while we're in these imperfect spaces, while we stay committed to in demanding that the spaces themselves improve.
Yes. Dr. Hernandez, you want to add anything? But that was just, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Montgomery that this is like a really tough question, but I think, I agree with what she was saying that, we have to find those collective healing circles, right? Because oftentimes we just want somebody to bend with, right? Somebody who understands us. And oftentimes, in our respective spaces, in order for us to bend to a white colleague, we kind of have to educate them as to why was this a microaggression, right? And when we just want to bend, we don't want to do the educational piece. And I think that, finding circles like Black and Marine Science and also supporting those circles if you're an ally, right? Become an accomplice, become somebody who does the behind work, who supports it, who funds it, who doesn't need that name recognition because they don't need to. They're becoming an accomplice, right? They're not trying to be a superficial ally where I want my name stamp on this recording because I donated X amount of money. And I think just finding spaces, being in conversation with people. I know that I wouldn't have survived my PhD if I didn't find professors in the American Department of American Indian Studies. And oftentimes people are like, even my white professors were like, oh, why are you going to that department? I was like, in my mind, I was like, oh, it's because that's where I have found a community. That's where I have found people who look like me, people who understand what I'm going through without having to educate them as to what you just said was a microaggression. And I think that, unfortunately, it's like a balancing act because, we know that Black and Indigenous and professors of color are overworked because, oftentimes many students of color go to them. But I think it's just, finding those spaces, whether it be outside of academia, where you can have a Black collective, an Indigenous collective, a Native tribe, where you can just like be yourself without, having to put on all these masks so that you can navigate these spaces. And I think that, we're often told, you have to learn how to play the game, but sometimes we don't even want to play a game because we already know that this game was created to make us lose, right? So you're like, I'm never going to be a winner. So I think, just taking care of yourself, doing self-care. And I think that, it's a collective leadership movement. Like I agree with Dr. Montgomery and there's still a lot that we have to do. And we just have to be careful that we don't burn out and that we also take care of our mental health, right? Because that's something that actually impacts us wholly as well.
Dr. Moore, could I just add, I wanted to read a quote actually from Jessica's book that I think is so applicable to this moment. So she was talking about her roots and she said, anywhere I end up, I carry these roots with me and replant them in my new location. They are the foundation of my existence, resistance, and resilience. And I think that's also the answer. We have to understand what the roots of what our roots are. What are the roots that have gotten us to this place sane, gotten us to this place whole, gotten us to this place with a sense of self-actualization, and carry those with us everywhere. Somebody asked me, how was I going to be in Iowa? And I said, I'm at home everywhere I go, right? Because I'm home. Home is me and my ancestors and everything that they've planted in me. And so that quote I just thought was so important in the context of the book, but I think also had relevance to this moment. So thank you for indulging me and letting me share that.
Oh, no, thank you for doing my job. I appreciate you. But no, I think that was an awesome quote. And somehow we're almost at the end, but I want to think about ending on just the future and your vision of the future. If you could just say, not only say briefly, but what does this decolonized conservation look like? What does your vision for the future of science and botany and marine science, plant science, all the sciences that we've been involved with? What does your vision look like? You close your eyes and it's a perfect day. What does that look like? I would love to hear it. Dr. Hernandez, you want to start?
Yeah, and I wanted to connect it back to the excerpt that Dr. Montgomery mentioned about her book. And I think that, it just made me realize that we're all those baby trees, right? And one day we're going to grow into those grandma trees. And I think that collectively, and it kind of allowed me to kind of connect the relationship that your son has with his baby tree. So I think that, we are all baby trees that the 7 generations are going to be caretaking for. And, hopefully in the future, we're going to collectively build a forest, right? Where we no longer feel like we're the only ones. And right now, many of us, we can see ourselves as baby trees. And like, for instance, in Iowa, right, being the only baby tree there. But one day, we're going to be the mother tree or the grandmother tree for an entire forest. And I think that, that's like a beautiful way that I just envision Dr. Montgomery's excerpt, especially, connecting it to that baby tree and it becoming eventually an old growth, hopefully in the future.
My vision of the future is a freedom dream. And it's partially stolen from a friend of mine, Tori Weaston Sheridan, who wrote a book on critical mentoring. But she talks about the idea that we have an ecosystem where we're not just teaching people how to persist in toxic air and polluted water, but that we are a collective community ensuring that every expression of humanity has a possibility to thrive because we are collectively focused on cleaning the air and cleaning the water so that all of our greatest expressions of our human selves can come to fruition. So that's my freedom dream. I'm not going to see it in my lifetime, but I'm going to go down trying.
Oh my goodness, this was just so great. Thank you so much. I think that just says so much about everything that we've been talking about is how we're not necessarily fighting this fight for us. And I think that is the part that can be a bit daunting. Because it's like, what you mean? I did all this hard work. I'm never gonna be welcome. But I think that hope of like, there's little baby trees that will be welcome into this forest that we've created is enough to keep us going, for me to get up tomorrow and know I probably got 10 foolish meetings, but it's gonna be okay because we are watering this forest and we're taking care of this environment that we want to create. So I thank you all so much for this conversation. We are literally out of time. The time is up. We're supposed to be Dr. Hernandez who's going to do a book giveaway, and I can't even think of a question. So I'm going to ask the YouTube, if you remember, is how Dr. Montgomery defined hope. What did she say? I said it a couple times. So if you can put it in the YouTube chat, you're the first person. She said, hope is something. Put that in the YouTube chat and you will get a free copy of Fresh Banana Leaves. And then maybe we'll talk about, another giveaway at a different time, but we just were so action-packed in the conversation. So let me see if you remember what Dr. Montgomery said about hope. What is hope? And put that into the chat and you will be getting a free copy. I'm looking now. But yeah, thank y'all again so much. This has been awesome. This has been just such a great, y'all are getting so much love in the chat. I'm just letting y'all know I'm on the YouTube over here on the side and it's like, yeah, y'all are getting so much love. Thank you. Someone said, oh, yep, Allie, you got it. Hope is the commitment. Yes, thank you. So Allie,
Can I just say thank you to you, Dr. Moore? That was some amazing moderation. And the conversation only was because you were here. So thank you. And again, congratulations to you, Jessica, on this book. Keep writing. We need your voice. Keep writing.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Moore and Dr. Montgomery. It was like an honor to share this space. And, you're my baby trees that I look up to. And hopefully I can plant my roots next to you, especially, with all the amazing work you both have done. So thank you again.
Yes, so be sure to follow them on Twitter. Dr. Hernandez is Doctora Nature. We should be having someone put this on the chat right now. Dr. Montgomery is Baronda M. We're also going to put the links for you to go and buy these books. Please support these powerful books. You can just click the link that we put in the chat. And then, of course, make sure you follow Black and Marine Science and subscribe to BIMS TV for more events. Tomorrow, we have our PhD student, Salome Berglass, talking all things marine kelp on BIMS Bites at 10 a.m. So please be sure you tune in. You won't want to miss it.